Okay, last, excuse me, or 2 units ago, we looked at some of the beginnings of literature in Rome. And then in this unit, we're taking a little bit closer look. There's already been one slideshow on some of the general underpinnings of Roman literature, if you will. But I want to do one more quickly just to kind of flesh out what your textbook says about Augustan literature, literature that was written during the age of Augustus. It really is a kind of golden age of literature in Rome. It's often labeled as such. It's not the best term anymore, but anyways, just because it's kind of so high quality. So just the quantity of work that's produced and the quality of it really is kind of astounding. Um, so just I want to just go through a few details. Now, just again, as background, we've looked at the beginnings of literature in Rome, how it's connected with expansion of empire. We started taking a look, more specifically at the later Republic. And remember, there we saw a general kind of trend towards Hellenization, not just in literature, but in culture more generally speaking. And it's during this time that we really see more and more Greek works, authors being introduced to Romans, especially Greek work that was produced in Alexandria. Remember, Alexandria is in Egypt, and there's a very famous museum there called the Museion. That's like a library. Excuse me, the House of the Muses. That's where we get the word museum. Anyways, so there's a big library there, and lots of really a lot of high quality work was produced there under with some different kind of ideals than previously in Greece. And it is a lot of these models that are picked up by Romans in the first century. We did quickly talk about Catullus early in the first century, who's one of the first to pick up on these Alexandrian authors, introduce them to Rome, and then it really kind of takes off. Okay. So I really just want to review quickly three authors, all of whom are mentioned in your textbook, and they really are kind of quintessential Augustan authors. Now, one is Horace. His full name is Quintus Horatius Flaccus, but he just goes by Horace. Now, you can see his dates, 65 to 8 BC. I've mentioned him a few times in this chapter and previously. He's the son of a freedman, so his dad's a former slave. And he's from a small town called Venusi in the south of Italy. But as I mentioned before, his dad, realizing the importance of education, kind of scrimped, saved, took every step possible to ensure that his son got a good education. And he did, receiving not only in Rome, but often he also went to Athens. This is what a lot of upper class Romans did. You'd go to Athens. That was kind of your university away, if you will. All right, that's where you get your really good education. So well educated, then had a typical kind of military career, as most young men would do after their education was finished, and in politics, ideally. He actually sided with the conspirators, Brutus and Cassius. In fact, Brutus rounded up a lot of, or found a lot of support in Athens amongst young Romans that were there, and that's where he was introduced to Brutus and kind of fought alongside him. Fortunately for him, there was kind of an amnesty, so he was kind of forgiven. Clemency was given, and he became part of Augustus's kind of inner circle. This was primarily through the patronage of a prominent Roman by the name of Maecenas. Maecenas was a friend of Augustus. They did have a later falling out, but he was one of the biggest supporters of the cultural program of Augustus, if you want to call it that, by supporting a new talent in writing, and one of these people was Horace. And Horace, in his writings, actually talks about his introduction to Maecenas and how he became his patron. He wrote a variety of works, but I'd say probably his most famous is the Odes, kind of 4 books of Odes, in which he writes in a variety of Greek meters, lyric Greek meters. So he actually looks back to people like Sappho and other Greek authors, but on very Roman themes. Another famous work, and one of the first things he wrote, was called Satires. Satire is actually one of the, I think it's the only kind of original Roman genre. So he was a practitioner of satire. They're very interesting works too. So those are the kind of things that he is famous for. But he did other things, other works as well. I'm just kind of mentioning the main ones. Livy, or Titus Livius, was a historian. We know that. We've come across him a few times. But again, he's the kind of quintessential historian of the Augustan period. Had the support of the emperor and others. Here, too, you can see his dates, 64 to about 12. He, too, is from a small town, Padua, in the north of Italy. All right. And, of course, he is a historian. Massive work. It's called the Ab Urba Condita, which literally translates as from, that's ab, the foundation, condita, of the city, urba. And what that means is a historian from the foundation of Rome up to the age of Augustus. So kind of 700 years of history, right? So he talks about Romulus and Remus, gives all that. Not the entire work. We're missing some parts of it, not all of it. It's dozens and dozens of volumes, and not all of them have been preserved. But we have most of them. So it's a huge work. And as we talked about earlier in that earlier slideshow in this unit, he saw his history as not only kind of laying out the history for practical purposes, but also had moral and didactic purposes. Moral and didactic. Didactic means kind of teaching, right? Didaxis means teaching. So the idea was not these moral examples, but they could teach people, right? Give you good or bad models of behavior. So a huge historical work. But the name is probably synonymous with Augustan literature or Augustan poetry is Virgil, Publius Virgilius Maro. He is often referred to as kind of the Roman kind of Homer, the greatest poet. Some people even hold him to be better than Homer. Who knows? He's my specialty, so I have some preferences. Anyways, you can see his date, 70 to 19 BC. Okay. He too, small town, Mantua, right? Kind of central to northern Italy. He also won the patronage of Maecenas, so Maecenas supported him so he could write. Virgil wrote 3 works. Right? His first was called the Eclogues, a collection of 10 poems called pastoral poetry. It's basically shepherds exchanging songs. Okay. His second work is called the Georgics, and this is kind of a didactic poetry. It's kind of about tending the land, about beekeeping and so forth. It's 4 books of poetry, all based on, say, crops, viticulture, this kind of growing of vines and grapes and stuff like that. So it's kind of outward guise. That's what it looks like, but it's about more than that, obviously. Okay, it gauges all sorts of things. But perhaps, of course, his most famous work is the Aeneid, right? The tale of Aeneas. Now we're familiar with Aeneas. We went through all the foundation myths and so forth. But this poem basically tells of the adventures of Aeneas from the sack of Troy to his arrival in Italy and his defeat of one of the key Italian princes. Okay. Now, the writing of this was a huge undertaking and very audacious and bold, because when it came to epic, the master, of course, was Homer. And ever since Homer appeared, he's always considered the greatest author in antiquity, right? Amongst the Greeks, amongst the Romans, just the best, right? So to say that you're going to be writing an epic in a Homeric spirit, meaning engaging with some of these same myths and writing in a way that's reminiscent of Homer, that was really bold on his part. Lots of people wanted him to do it, especially Augustus, because they felt they needed this kind of equivalent, a Roman equivalent. So he took upon himself to write this poem. And just let me talk about, I can't go into all the details about it, but let me just show you how he kind of picks up the Homeric models, but then puts his own kind of spin on them, right? It's not this kind of poor replication of Homer. It's something completely new. So remember, Homer wrote 2 poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Iliad deals with conflict at the Battle of Troy, just kind of a couple of weeks. So it occurs during, it's a war poem. And then the Odyssey deals with the aftermath of war. Remember, that deals with the travels of Odysseus from Troy back to his home in Greece, all the adventures that he has, running into the Cyclops, all that kind of stuff. So 2 big Homeric poems, each of them broken down into what are called books, 24 books or 24 chapters. 24 because there's 24 letters in the Greek alphabet, okay? So that's 48 books in total. Now, when it came time to write the Aeneid, and, Virgil was considering its shape and what to include, note how When we turn to the Aeneid, it actually has 12 books. So it's kind of half of each. But what's interesting, people often notice that it is kind of broken down. We have 48 books kind of condensed, if you will, into 12, 48 Homer into 12 of Virgil. Now, what I mean by that is that if we take a look at the 12 books or chapters of the Aeneid, the first 6 basically deal with the voyage from Troy and its sack to landing in Italy, literally landing on the shores of Italy. Okay. The second half deals with the conflict with the Italians who are living there because they're not immediately welcomed. The Italians, under the leadership of a person called Turnus, fight against Aeneas, and it ends with the defeat of Turnus and the victory of Aeneas at the end of Book 12. But what I'm kind of getting at here is you can see is Virgil has basically condensed the Iliad and the Odyssey into one work. This is why the first part is often referred to as the Odyssean half of the Aeneid, because it deals with all the voyages through the Mediterranean, just like what happens with the Odyssey. In fact, he runs in, there's a lot of kind of parallel tales. And in the second half, the second 6 books, that's kind of like the Iliadic half, because it's the kind of war half, the conflict with the Italians and the war there. Right? So you can see already just when it comes time to deciding to write the Aeneid, Virgil has given very careful consideration to its structure and how it kind of recalls the Iliad and the Odyssey, but then, of course, compresses the two into one. Right? So we already see him there, just in the structure, engaging with Homer in a very advanced way. But also take a look at the first lines. First lines, as we actually saw in this unit, the beginnings of poems, the beginnings of work literature are always very, very important. They're often referred to as programmatic, in which an author kind of lays out his goals or his ideals. So what I've done here is the very first lines of each of the poems. The beginning of the Iliad says, "Sing, O goddess, the anger of Achilles, son of Peleus, that brought countless ills upon the Achaeans." Achaeans just is a word for Greeks. The first word in Greek is actually anger. Main, that occurs right here. That's the very first word of the Iliad. And that's fitting because the whole poem is about the rage or the anger of Achilles. Okay? But you can see what happens is Homer calls on the muse or the goddess, a goddess of epic poetry, to sing through him. Okay? And then in the Odyssey he says again, "Tell me, O muse, of that many-sided hero who traveled far and wide after he had sacked the famous town of Troy." So you can see, whereas the Iliad's about the anger of Achilles, here it's about the many-sided hero. It's a tale about Odysseus. Okay, and that's why that's the first word in that poem. Okay, and then when we get to the Aeneid, you can see here the very first famous words are "arma vironkoikano." Arma means arms, like weapons, and virum, that's the word for man. Kano just means I sing. So I sing of arms and the man. There's a lot going on in just these kind of 3 words here, right? And especially when we compare it to the Iliad and the Odyssey. First of all, notice how Homer, he calls upon the goddess, the muse, to sing through him. So he, in a sense, is just like a vessel through which his voice passes. But notice in Virgil, right, he sings in the first person. Kano, it's I sing. So he's not calling somebody else. Later, at the beginning, he does call on the goddess to help him, but the first thing he says is, "I'm going to sing this." So that's pretty bold and audacious, and I'd say that marks a departure from these Homeric models. The other thing is, if you notice, arma and virum, so arms and the man, these actually also recall the Iliad and the Odyssey. Because the arms, well, that recalls the Iliad because it's a war poem, it's about fighting. And virum, or man, that recalls the Odyssey. Okay, so you can see the very first 2 words, of the Aeneid, arms and the man. Already he's marking a reference to the Iliad and the Odyssey, but then he follows that with the first person, where he says, "I am doing this." Okay. The other thing you can read into this, and I said there's a lot of, you could go on and on about these 3 words, they're so important, is that he's not simply saying, "I sing of arms, and then I'm going to sing of the man." But as people have suggested, what the Iliad is really about is the relationship between those. Okay. Now, what I mean by that is the relationship between man and weapons, and specifically how and when is the appropriate or the right time to use weapons. So it's not just arms and the man, but it's the relationship between the two. Okay, this is what appears so often in the Aeneid. And when we think about that, that is a very kind of Roman concept, right? So not only is he kind of making these allusions to Homer, but he's also marking differences. So I'm doing this, but also another thing that I'm concerned about is how to use violence. When do you use it? When is the appropriate time, or when is it not appropriate to do it? And of course, these are some of the issues that, say, a Roman emperor, a Roman general, a Roman soldier would be forced to consider. It's unlike the Greek world, right, where Achilles just goes on rampages. He doesn't really care about how he applies his violence. Okay, but in Rome, where there's more of a concept of duty, obligation to others, when to use violence, right? That is a huge question. So as to say, even in these first three words, you can see the way that Virgil is announcing that, hey, yes, I'm writing in a kind of Homeric vein, in a kind of Homeric epic tradition, but I'm doing it for a new Roman context. Okay, and this is one thing that's so remarkable about the Aeneid, and this kind of goes really. It could apply to the other authors that we've been taking a look at. And this is why literature written during this period is so good, is that they didn't just kind of slavishly kind of copy Greek models, but they learned from them and applied them to a new Roman context. Because you simply couldn't import Homer into Rome and kind of write in that vein with the kind of the ideals and values of Homeric heroes, because it doesn't work in Rome, right? There are more concepts such as duty, the appropriate use of a kind of force, obligations to your ancestors and those who come after your successors. These are all things that were important to the Roman way of thinking, and they're incorporated into the Aeneid. And this is what really makes it such a superb piece of work, is the way that it manages to do so. It's really mind-blowing when you see the detail and complexity with which he does it. It's really kind of unmatched. So I urge you to, of course, to pick up the Aeneid one day. If you're in English or in history or anything like that, it's kind of worth your time. It's just so hugely influential for all, or for much later literature. So hopefully just this really quick review of these three authors gives you a sense of some of the work that was being produced in Augustan period and some of the ends to which it was applied.